I'm Larry Fedoruk, and this is Later That Same Life, a weekly podcast of topics, discussions, or stories from our lives.
Season 7, Chapter 9.
Another trip around the sun.
A few weeks ago on this podcast, I introduced you to my Council of Advisors, my fantasy team of smart people meant to inspire me to greater things. I would like to thank Council member CNN's Fareed Zakaria for the inspiration for this week's title, Another Trip Around the Sun. This is my 2022 year in review. On a personal note, it was a good year. I got out a little more, instituted a new, personal, more relaxed mask mandate policy, but I've not given up the mask. Hand sanitizing and hand washing standards are still pretty high, but I have stopped entirely wiping down my groceries with Clorox. I am vaxxed to the max and will continue to be so. I accept that COVID will be some part of the rest of my life. I also want to thank you for continuing to support this podcast, which in 2022 received 4 nominations for Canadian Podcast Awards, including a People's Choice nom. Now, at the awards in November, I went 0 for 4, but it's not just a cliche. It is a thrill to be nominated. Easily the 2 biggest stories of 2022 are 1, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which began on February 24th of the year, and 1A, inflation. Those 2 stories occupied and affected us intellectually, psychologically, and physically. Confirmed and rubber-stamped to the rest of the world was the power-hungry insanity of Vlad Putin, the mad monk of Moscow, and the heroism of former actor-comedian Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Not only has he performed remarkably, but it's really him and him alone that continues to keep the plight of Ukraine up front to the rest of the world. You know, it's a world that has the attention span of a child touching a hot stove. There is a bit of a waning interest in the rest of the world to continue to spend money in helping defend this free nation of Ukraine. They say Putin is counting on that, but it's usually Zelensky via video or even flying to Washington in person, reminding the world about the tragedy of war and the injustice of egomaniacal aggression. Invasion, inflation. 2 big stories, and they are interwoven. Russia, often described as a gas station masquerading as a country, invaded Ukraine, but was quickly, quote-unquote, at war with the rest of the world. Massive sanctions against Putin's Petro-Russia disrupted the flow of their oil and natural gas, making the rest of the world market more volatile. Once gas and oil go up, can unmanageable inflation be far behind? The world runs on gas and oil, including every stage of production and delivery of goods and services, including food. It's not the only reason everything is costing more, but it's one of the big ones. As soon as everyone starts paying more for fuel, then everyone will also pay more for everything else. Speaking of fuels, another big story this year, again, were warnings of danger due to extreme climate change. Once again, half the world burns while the other half floods, and these dire warnings tend to be ignored. Another UN climate conference, known as COP, attracted hundreds of activists and politicians, all flying in on large jets, leaving a big carbon footprint just so that someone will hear them talking green. Some of the largest contingents at these climate conferences are teams of lawyers and executives representing large oil interests and other fossil fuel fans. This year, COP27 was held in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, which is even more ridiculous than having the World Cup in Qatar. But we'll talk more about that later. This year, we had historic rains and floods in Pakistan and Nigeria, most notably, These are two countries that contribute least to a global carbon footprint, but they tend to suffer the most because of it. At the most recent COP conference in 2022, there was a proposal for rich polluting nations to compensate the poorer suffering ones. Of course, the richer countries, they don't want to pay. And though they finally agreed to some remuneration, most wonder if those needy nations will ever see a dime. The first dire warnings of our unsustainable polluting practices came in 1957. So you can understand how after 65 years of cautions and alerts, the whole thing might begin to sound like a lot of background noise. So I include climate change as a major story of 2022 because it is, and yet it isn't. And let me make this distinction. When people say we've got to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels, it's true. But it's about the life of the planet, because lessening our reliance on fossil fuels will not solve geopolitical or geoeconomic issues. The world needs energy, and whatever we pick, clean or dirty, energy sources will always be at the center of political disagreement, economic disparity, and international division. Invasion, inflation. Most of our mental energy focused on those two for 2022. In September, however, we took an 11-day break from these issues to focus on the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. 90% of the world had known no other head of the British monarchy. And even at that, I thought the coverage was over the top. The person herself and 70 years of service, I guess, deserves some recognition. But as I said in my previous podcast about this topic, the royal family in England, they're like that country's Disneyland. So I have no problem with people flocking to see the castle and ride the teacups. But in every other country that has a Disneyland, the president or the prime minister do not have to consult the mouse before they start their government. During the almost 2 weeks of coverage, there was a mass murder in Saskatchewan involving 2 Aboriginal communities and 2 Indigenous suspects. There was a multi-day manhunt, and both suspects ended up dead. This was barely covered by the CBC. They had poured all their resources into London, England, and another report on what kind of flowers were on the royal casket. Once again, Indigenous peoples in Canada were let down by 3 major institutions: the CBC, the RCMP, and the government. The government, a constitutional monarchy. The Queen and a bunch of people in Saskatchewan were dead. Long live the King. What I thought was more interesting to England, and no, it's not the Harry and Meghan Netflix special, is that their conservative government is in complete disarray. That also happened this year. They went through 3 prime ministers in a matter of weeks, and they ended up with the richest guy in the country. He's richer than the royal family. But he said he feels the voters' pain and promised to work for the people. In reviewing the 2022 year, here's my obligatory look at America. Their Supreme Court virtually canceled 50 years of women's rights by reversing Roe v. Wade, and in doing so also reduced the credibility of that court to record lows. The January 6th committee, you know we're coming up to the 2nd anniversary of that event? The committee recommended several criminal charges be brought against Donald Trump, who has since been busted for stealing government documents and storing them around the house in Mar-a-Lago. His tax returns have been released. A billionaire who paid over $700 in income tax one year. Trump also declared that he will run again in 2024, and he released a series of NFT trading cards depicting him as a superhero, cowboy, astronaut, and football star. America also continues to be stumped by what appears to be an ever-increasing amount of migrants at their borders. Well, the Republican governors have that one idea. You put them on a bus or a plane to Martha's Vineyard. America. Frankly, I'm tired of even giving them air. The United States of America, built on slavery, greed, and corruption. They've assassinated 4 presidents and attempted on a few others. They had an all-out civil war and a complete insurrection interrupting the peaceful transfer of power. That sounds like a banana republic. They're a banana republic that can't even grow their own bananas. Yet somehow in America this year, they have discovered profitable, controlled nuclear fusion and sent a rocket to the moon and back. But no one can seem to solve the big fat guy from Florida. Also in America in 2022, Musk bought Twitter. Socially awkward man overpays for social platform. What could go wrong? Hey, if you're still looking for someone to run it, I'll do it. Could I do a worse job than the previous management? In 2022, Xi Jinping solidified his extended power in China. This in a year that country seems less willing to be a global citizen. In that communist nation, people took to the streets to protest strict zero-COVID policies. Although as far as I know, none of them parked their trucks at the Capitol. And yes, it's taken me this long into this podcast to mention the Canadian truckers' protest in Ottawa. That too was just this year. It was a big story. The federal government eventually invoked the Emergency Measures Act, and then later we had weeks and weeks of hearings as to the validity of that invocation. That's called checks and balances. Apparently a second protest is planned for the new year. I respect the right to protest. You know, a Canadian's right to hot tub on Wellington Street in the winter. But I am offended by their use of the term freedom convoy. If I thought it was about freedoms, I might not be so averse to their horn honking. Speaking of right-wing fascists, in 2022 they won in Italy. They came closer to winning in France than they ever had before. They planned an overthrow of the governments in Germany. They won in the Philippines. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Can you believe it? Mind you, they did lose in Brazil. Although in Brazil, it took a runoff election, and the losing side refused to concede. Many of those supporters actually parked their trucks in protest. There are at least 24 nations who face general elections in 2023. And by the way, Iran is not one of them. 2022 saw huge protests against strict Islamic law after a woman died in custody. She was being arrested for not wearing her hijab properly. Protests in support sprang up all over the rest of the world. The government of Iran executes their own citizens for protesting, and yes, they also make weapons that they send to Russia. One of my last items on my list of major 2022 stories, the World Cup. 2022 was a World Cup year, but not in the summer as usual, in December. Football championship held in the nation of Qatar. Let me just refer to my World Cup podcast of a few weeks ago. 2022 World Cup. Awarded in the shadow of fraud and corruption, built on the broken backs of migrant workers, and held under the thumb of human rights abuse. At the wrong time of year, with no beers. Canada was respectable, Argentina won, France lost. Does it matter? Before I leave this year in review, I do want to acknowledge the people we lost this past year. On December 31st, 2021, we lost our beloved Betty White at age 99. People had already been planning the 100th birthday parties and TV specials. You know, because that's what you have to do. You have to plan ahead. Of course, then many others felt like that was some kind of a curse. It was the reason she didn't actually make it to 100. Of course, that's absurd, but at the beginning of 2022, it inspired me to make up a list of people that were 90 and older and still with us. I posted the list on social, and with your help, the list grew to almost 90 people who were 90 or older. Unexpectedly, in the last 12 months, we did lose some of those nonagenarians. In 2022, Sidney Poitier passed at age 94. Within days of each other, we lost the two actresses who played the moms on Seinfeld. George's mom, played by Estelle Harris, she passed, she was 93. Liz Sheridan, Jerry's mom, also 93. Actor Philip Baker Hall passed at age 90, also known for Seinfeld, among many other roles, but he was Bookman, the library cop that interrogates Jerry. Also passing at 93, singer C.W. McCall of Convoy fame. CBC Hall of Famer Patrick Watson was 92. Actor Larry Storch was 99. Entertainer Pat Carroll passing at age 95. Legendary sportscaster Vin Scully at 94. Angela Lansbury was 96, as was Robert Clary. Now, he played LeBeau on Hogan's Heroes. Loretta Lynn was 90 when she passed this year. So was Sesame Street stalwart Bob McGrath. Remember Conrad Janis? He played Mindy's dad on Mork and Mindy. We lost him this year at age 94. You might not recognize this name, but a face you would know instantly from countless TV shows and movies. Nehemiah Persoff. He passed this year. He was 102. Mikhail Gorbachev was 91. Also, of course, already mentioned Queen Elizabeth, who was 96. My list of famous folk, 90 and older, is still pretty long. And then, of course, a bunch of 89-year-olds will be on that roster soon. You might be surprised of some of the people who are 90 or older, and by some of the people who are still around and active. I don't want to mention any of their names, because if I do and then they pass, I'll be blamed for their deaths, just like those people who killed Betty White by planning her birthday party ahead of time. As well as those nonagenarians, this year we sadly lost comedians Bob Saget, Louis Anderson, and Gilbert Gottfried. Passing in 2022 were film directors Peter Bogdanovich and Ivan Reitman. We lost singers Ronnie Spector and Bobby Rydell, and singer-actor Meatloaf. Passing were actors Ralph Emery, Sally Kellerman, Howard Hessman, William Hurt, Louise Fletcher, and Emilio Delgado, the latter also of Sesame Street fame. We lost hockey legends Mike Bossy, later in the year Boreas Salming, and Guy Lafleur. Guy Lafleur's passing became a national event and a state funeral in Quebec. Loss of other notable Canadians included Susan Jacks, Jerry Doucette, and adopted son Ronnie Hawkins. Early summer was tragic for actors who played gangsters. In just a few days, we lost Ray Liotta, James Caan, Paul Sorvino, and Tony Sirico. Tony was Paulie Walnuts on The Sopranos. This year, we lost actor Bo Hopkins, Foo Fighters drummer Taylor Hawkins, and mid-July, Ivana Trump. From the legendary days of television, actor Tony Dow and Nichelle Nichols. Gone are legendary basketballer and activist Bill Russell, football legend, the Immaculate Reception, Franco Harris, NFL star quarterback Len Dawson. Also in the sporting world, baseball greats Maury Wills and Gaylord Perry, and pioneering CNN anchor Bernard Shaw. Also leaving us this year was actor Robbie Coltrane, and in the music world, Naomi Judd, country star Mickey Gilley, from Seals and Crofts, Jim Seals, Aaron Carter, Jerry Lee Lewis, Coolio, Irene Cara, Christine McVie, and of course, Olivia Newton-John. Later in the year, Specials lead singer Terry Hall and Canadian singer-songwriter Shirley Eichhardt. Gone in 2022 were comedian Gallagher, comedic actor Stuart Margolin, and Emmy-winning actress Kirstie Alley. I think my list is pretty comprehensive. My apologies if I have inadvertently left out some well-known someone that you love that we lost in 2022. In closing, another piece of the world history happened in 2022. The world population hit 8 billion people. That was just back in November. I did a podcast on that if you want to go back and check it out. We were 3 billion people in 1960. And since then, about every dozen years or so, we add another billion people. But according to the United Nations published research, we will peak at about 10.4 billion somewhere in the next 20 to 30 years. And then we'll level out at that number till at least the year 2100. How? Well, birth and death rates will start to become even. And yes, already crowded places will become slightly more crowded, but the real significant population growth is going to be in the relatively underpopulated continent of Africa. Africa has room, so to speak. Plus, Africa has had decades upon decades of a reputation for poverty, disparity, civil unrest, and corrupt regimes. More than ever, they are fighting to change that reputation. And they have a lot of raw materials that are of great value to a changing new world. The USA and China once again see this continent as a new frontier, and not for takeover, as in the old colonial days, but for co-development. In Africa, 2023 could very well mark the beginning of the beginning. 2022, another trip around the sun in strange times. The world may seem crazy, but I'll tell you something about the Earth. It's still the best damn planet I've ever lived on. Auld Lang Syne. It means times long past. And in the traditional song of the season, we sing, "We'll drink a cup of kindness yet for the sake of Auld Lang Syne." How about we drink more cups of kindness for the sake of times still ahead? Happy New Year.
Later That Same Life is written, produced, and voiced by Larry Fedoruk. Larry Fedoruk, 37 at gmail.com. Subscribe to Larry's podcast YouTube channel. Get automatic notifications with each new episode.
Should old acquaintance be forgot?